Have you ever felt like you're having a pretty lousy reading month, only to look back and realize you've read a few thousand pages? Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome and welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for spending some time with me. So today I want to share with you a little bit about what the first half of my month of May has been like, what I've been up to. And, as I mentioned in the teaser, I had this feeling that I wasn't really making any progress and it was kind of not a great reading month. And then I looked back and I realized that I've read quite a lot in the first 2 weeks of this month. And I think part of my reason for having that feeling was if you watched my April video, my wrap up video for April, I had a really ambitious TBR for May. And it doesn't feel like I'm taking any big chunks out of that TBR. And so there's a disconnect between my expectations or hopes and then what I've actually read. But that shouldn't really preclude me from having a good reading month. So my expectations kind of tempered my mood, which was, my fault, So it's just something I was realizing and thinking about. The other thing is that I've read a number of audiobooks this month, 4 so far. And as I mentioned before as well, the audiobooks I read all come from the library. And so what audiobooks I read are kind of at the whimsy of the library. I have a bunch of holds and books requested. And when they come in, I have 2 weeks to read them. So they don't usually line up with my TBR, so they take time away from my TBR. So as a result, a lot of the books I read aren't part of my TBR, which was part of the reason that my TBR isn't going down, even though I've done a substantial amount of reading. Now, having said that, this is actually the second time I'm recording this video. The first time, I got less than halfway through recording and realized it was already more than a half hour long. And I'm not going to do that to you guys. Most people, or many people on BookTube, record a video every week talking about their weekly wrap-up. And I don't really have a schedule that lets me do that, which is why I do a bi-weekly wrap-up. But maybe I'm going to try to change things a little bit because these bi-weekly wrap-ups, they just seem to be overstuffed. They're overfilled. So maybe if I change the days I release my videos or something, I can make a weekly wrap-up work. I'm not quite sure. I'd love to hear your thoughts if you have an opinion about it. That would let me not be quite so frantic whenever I do these. I'm sure, though, if I do change things, as soon as I do, I'm going to have a number of weeks in a row where I don't read anything. But what to do? If you have any opinions, I'd love to hear it. So with that said, I'm going to go through these somewhat quickly. For all my reviews, I have reviews on GoodReads that are linked in the description box. So you can go check those reviews out at any time. And if there's a book that I mentioned that you would like to hear more about that I don't really talk at length about, just write it down in the comments and I'd be happy to share more in the comments, But for the sake of brevity, I'm going to try to make this video a little more streamlined, which, as you can tell, I'm not very good at, so we'll see how that goes. Now, before I jump into the books, a few other things, a little housekeeping. One of the things I was doing in May that did prevent me from really digging into my TBR was I was proofreading Trash Tales, which is the new anthology of trashy fiction, trashy short stories that is being put out by CriminOlly. Of course, last year, he released GARBOLOGY, and this year, Trash Tales is coming up, and it's going to be released in August. The 1st of August. I contributed a story last year to GARBOLOGY and this year to Trash Tales. And last year, when Troy Trotup, who was the editor for GARBOLOGY, was talking about it, he mentioned that he didn't do all the editing himself. He had people helping him because it's a lot of work to edit 24 stories or so. This year, Troy is not the editor. Alex from Alex Unabridged is the editor, and he and Ollie are working together. And so I offer my help. I said, look, regardless of whether my story is accepted or not, I'd be more than happy to help in any way I can at any part of the process. So just let me know. And so they accepted my offer. And so I have been proofreading for them. And through the month of May, I've read almost all of the stories. I think there's a few that I haven't had a chance to look at yet. So the process. Alex has been detailing in videos the process to Trash Tales, and I'll put a link to his most recent video down below. But Ollie and Alex curate the whole collection, so they read all of the stories that come in, they choose what are going to be included in the collection, and they choose the order and so forth. Then once that's done, Alex does all the copy editing, and what he does as part of his copy edit process, as opposed to a developmental edit or a story edit, he talks about that in his video, so I will link that. Then once he's done copy editing, he sends it to me to proofread. Now, traditionally, as a proofreader, all I would be doing is making sure there are no spelling mistakes, making sure there are no grammar mistakes, and making sure that everything in the story lines up with the master style sheet that Alex created before the beginning of the project. Because I'm not, the best at keeping my opinions to myself, Alex gave me a little more leeway and to do what he calls proof editing instead of just proofreading. And what that basically means is if there are small things that I think snuck past him in the copy edit process that for some reason strike me as strange, such as, this paragraph needs a paragraph break because it's too long, or this phrase is mentioned more than one time in this one paragraph and it sounds awkward, so one of them has to be changed. little things like that, then I just make a note of it and send it back to Alex to see if he agrees or not. And so I'm not doing any actual editing, but I'm kind of just sending him some ideas. So that's what I've been doing the last couple weeks, and I've been having a great time with it. I'm really excited for this collection to come out. And then other things that have been on this channel the last couple weeks, I did 2 reviews for books that I really, really enjoy, 2 horror books that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but they're maybe some of the best horror books I've read this year. Definitely top 5, I think. Overgrowth by Mira Grant and When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy. So you can go check out those reviews if you're interested. And also I did a video about kind of creativity or artistic creation versus artistic consumption. And I like that video. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, I would recommend that as well. And I'll put a link to all those down in the description box below. So let's go on to what I've been reading. You see, this is what happens. I'm already 9 minutes in and I haven't even started talking about the books I've read yet. This is the problem. Anyway, I finished 11 titles in the first half of May. The first 2 of those don't really count. I finished them almost entirely in April and just turned the last few pages in May on the first day of May or second day of May or so. And then I had 4 audiobooks. And so aside from that, that means I had 5 full-length books. So some of them were short. So I'm going to go through these quickly, as I said. The first 2 books that I finished right on the cusp of May. The first one is Spiderlight by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This was phenomenal. This is a fantasy story, and it feels like a D&D campaign kind of mixed with Guardians for the Galaxy, if that makes sense. So this came out before the first movie was released, though obviously after the comic books. It is a fantasy story of a group going on a quest to fulfill a prophecy to defeat the Dark Lord. And the leader of this group is a priestess who is a priestess of the light, because everything in this world is this binary, light or dark. You know, you're either evil or good. And what they find on their quest is that in order to defeat the dark, they have to continually make compromises with their idea of dark and light. And, you know, even in her fellowship, at the beginning, you have her. She's this priestess who's going to fulfill this prophecy of the light. But then you have a sorcerer who isn't really light or dark. He kind of just does his own thing. You have 2 warriors, one of whom has like an interesting / not discussed past. The other one who is very much an entitled dude bro who you really learn to hate throughout the course of the story. And then there's a thief that rounds out her, little fellowship. And then they add someone too. After the first few chapters, they add someone else to their fellowship. And so there's obviously constant negotiation between light and dark. And this idea that anything can be binary is totally exploded by the world that they actually live in. So this is a great little story. It's a great quest. I think that the characters are wonderful. The world building is wonderful. It doesn't spend a whole lot of time just walking around on the trails, even though they are going on quest. You get that a lot in some of these epic fantasy style stories. There isn't a lot of that. They move pretty quickly. Like I said, it's a very short book. And the way it ends, I think, is a perfect little encapsulation of how Tchaikovsky creates story, and he takes character and he takes world and narrative and he fuses them in such a way to really explore different ideas. I just think it's really wonderfully done. I buddy read this with Alex, and to be honest, Alex and I are basically buddy reading the rest of Adrian Tchaikovsky's books that we haven't read yet. More or less one a month. We're just going through them. He's read more than me, so I'm playing catch up right now. And this is one of his shorter titles. Definitely check it out. The other book that I finished at the beginning of the month is The Gunslinger by Stephen King. I finished The Dark Tower. So there are 8 books in the Dark Tower series, and I finished them maybe in 2021 or 2022, and I have been itching for a reread since then. And committing yourself to an 8-book reread when there's so many other series and books that I want to read, it's not something I've jumped into, but I couldn't hold back any longer. So I reread The Gunslinger and reminded myself of why I enjoy it so much. It's such a stripped back and bare story. It really is. It's a Western, but it's a weird Western where all different worlds and universes kind of are colliding in this place that has moved on, right? This world that has moved on. And we follow Roland the Gunslinger as he's traveling through the desert, chasing the man in black. And he meets someone, and then he stops to tell them a story. So then you flash back to the massacre at Howe, and you get that story as told by Roland to this other person. And then he continues on his journey, and he meets a boy. And then when he meets Jake, he starts telling him about his childhood and his life as growing up to become a gunslinger. And so the story is told through storytelling, right? Which is something Stephen King really loves and is integral to The Dark Tower as a series, is this act of creating story and of creating mythology and then embedding yourself in mythology. So I had a great time returning to The Gunslinger. I don't know when I'm going to pick up the rest of the series. I don't know if it's going to be one a month or how it's going to go, but I'm excited to reread the whole Dark Tower, having read it once, going back to it. It feels much bigger going back to it a second time, knowing how everything progresses in the future. The next books I will talk about are the audiobooks that I read this month. The first one was The Rising by Brian Keene. This is a zombie novel that was part of the wave of really reigniting the love for zombies in the cultural zeitgeist. It came out in the early 2000s, and he has a different approach on zombies than almost everything else, and it has to do with demonic possession, essentially. And I'm not really giving anything away. You figure that out in the opening chapters. Demonic possession or some sort of possession. You don't really know. There's a lot of ambiguity about it. But so because of that, everyone becomes zombified. It doesn't matter if you get bitten or not bitten. As soon as you die, you become a zombie. And that includes animals as well. And the zombies can talk, they're coherent, they retain all the memories of the body that they inhabit, but they have some other agenda as well. In that regard, it's a very interesting take on zombies. The story does suffer from being 2 decades old. Even Brian Keene says that, he cringes when he rereads it. He doesn't recommend it. It's not his best work, but it is his first novel. It what broke him onto the scene. And it has a lot going for it. It is a journey, as many zombie novels are, and the characters are pretty archetypical. Our main character is a divorced dad who is traveling across the country to try to save his young son. And he meets up with a reverend who has lost his whole flock, but somehow hasn't lost his faith. And then they meet, a heroin addict who is also a sex worker, but has a heart of gold. And these are kind of the main characters. They don't actually meet in the beginning, but those are the stories that you're following. And then you also have the army and the national reservists who have all just become fascists. And that, I think, is one of the most interesting things, is to see how you add a little bit of chaos into people's lives, and they're so happy to embrace fascism. And they're so happy that as long as they're not on the bottom of the pile, it doesn't matter how awful the situation is and how much pain and suffering they're causing to others, as long as they feel like they have some control and they aren't on the very bottom. So that is very much prescient, considering certain political leanings that people are having right now in the world. So the story, it isn't mind-blowing, but it really did reinvigorate or help to reinvigorate the zombie genre. It's a series with, I think, 6 novels and a couple of short story collections. I've read the most recent short story collection, which are just short stories set in this world. So they're not continuous with any of the characters. And I really, really liked that. So you can see Brian Keene's writing just get better as he, over the last 20 years. And so I'm excited to keep going with the story. And we'll pick up the other ones as they become available from my library. Next, I read Devils Kill Devils by Johnny Compton. This is his second novel. His first novel was The Spite House, and I really liked The Spite House. And that followed a father who was taking care of his 2 daughters and running away from something. You don't know what he was running away from, but because they were running away from something, he was willing to take a job as a kind of caretaker of this more or less haunted house. And so they had a place to stay, and they could, be paid under the table because he was on the run. And that emotional core really made that story special. So it's not quite the same in Devils Kill Devils. I did enjoy the story. It's a take on a vampire story with really interesting interpretation of vampire lore, and what would vampires really look like, and what if vampires formed a religion, and what if there were other gods that were bigger and more powerful than the vampires, and the vampires themselves were in this weird middle ground between human and demigod. So that is really interesting. I liked that story. And the thrust of the narrative is we have this young woman, and on her wedding night, her brand new husband, is beaten to death really violently by her guardian angel. And so then the first half of the book, you get these flashbacks, and you find out that when she was a young girl, she was drowning in the ocean, and this man, presumably, saved her, and then disappeared. And then he didn't say a single word. And then later on in life, she was in another difficult situation where she was going to experience some sort of harm, and he showed up, and again, he saved her, and again, didn't say anything, and then disappeared. So they've come to believe that she has this guardian angel who's always watching out for her. And yet, on her wedding night, he shows up and bludgeons her husband to death in one of the most violent ways possible. But again, doesn't say anything, and then just disappears. So she has to figure out what's going on. So her and her brother and her best friend kind of go on this journey, and you get this back and forth between learning about her past and moving forward. And then you also have a second story where you're learning about this vampire lore, and that is running parallel with her dead husband's mother wants revenge because she's convinced that this woman must be the cause of her son's death. So these multiple stories are all moving at the same time. And the truth is, it just is a little bit too slow. I'd say this first 70% of the story of the novel is just really turning its wheels. And then at the 70% mark, things switch into high gear and it gets really exciting. But it just is a little bit too late in the story. Do you know what I mean? The build up there, it didn't have if you're going to take that long to do build up, you need a little more interiority and a little more interior journey, right? Internal journey, rather. And that didn't feel like it was happening. It felt like it was just really spinning its wheels and setting up chess pieces in a way that wasn't the most effective way to tell that story, unfortunately. So I liked the whole story. I thought the characters were good. I thought the world building was good. I thought the overall story, like the ideas behind it, were really fun to play with. I just think the pacing wasn't all that exceptional. But, your mileage may vary. If you like these very much slow burn kind of horror stories and you're interested in different takes on, classic horror monsters such as vampires, then this could be a fun one for you to pick up. Next, I read The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. And I have to say, I have an interesting relationship with Grady Hendrix because everyone loves Grady Hendrix. And, the first book I read from him was How to Sell a Haunted House. And I really enjoyed it. And I think I enjoyed it so much because the main characters are brother and sister. And again, the emotional relationship between those two main characters really carried that story for me. And I felt it was a really interesting exploration of looking at family, right? And so I really enjoyed that story. Then I read the Southern Book Club's Guide to How to Slay a Vampire or something like this, which everyone loves, and I did not like. I thought the characters were over the top and archetypical and not interesting at all. I thought the whole story was interesting. I just didn't like any of the characters. They felt like too flimsy for me. In this one, it's similar. The characters are leading towards camp, right? The characters the Final Girl Support Group, it takes place, I think, in 2010, and it's literally what it sounds like. So if you picture all of the famous slashers, so Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Scream, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then Silent Night, Deadly Night, which many people probably don't know, as not as famous as the other five. But the final girls that survive those 6 horror movies. What if those movies were based on real events, and the 6 women that lived through those events are in a support group? And that's the premise of the story. And one of them is murdered in the beginning, and so now they feel like all of them are being murdered. Someone has figured out who they are, and they are being hunted. The characters, because they are representing these like TV final girls, or these slasher film final girls, are over the top, and that's fine. But they're leaning into camp, not into like an emotional sincerity. But the story isn't leaning into camp, right? So there's this mismatch between tone. If the whole thing was over the top campy and twee and it was laughing at itself, then I would have had a lot of fun with it. But instead, the story tried to be emotional and tried to have these messages about being there for one another and sticking up for yourself, but being there for family and all of these things, and never letting, never leaving a girl behind like this. But the characters didn't resonate with that. The characters just felt over the top and not very deep, right, in any sort of emotional sense. So that disconnect, I enjoyed the story. I listened to it, and it was really well narrated, and I had a fun time listening to it, but I didn't connect to it in any meaningful way. And I would have liked it to be either more camp or more serious, but instead the characters felt campy and the story felt like it was trying not to be campy, and that felt like a disconnect to me. So I don't know how much more Grady Hendrix I'm going to read going forward. I'm always excited by his ideas. I think his ideas are really fun, and everyone else seems to love him, so I'm sure I'll pick more up from him in the future, but it's not at the top of my TBR right now. Then the other audiobook that I finished this month is a nonfiction book, and this is called Who is Government? The Untold Story of Public Service by Michael Lewis, and he actually was the editor of this, and this is great. It's this really short collection of essays. He wrote 2 of them, and then 6 others are written by people that he chose, notably writers. And so of the writers, just looking at it, the ones I recognize right away are Dave Eggers and W. Kamau Bell, and the others I didn't quite recognize. These are actually all already published in The Atlantic, so if you have a subscription to The Atlantic, you would have already read these, but now they're collected in this collection. And this came out of during Trump's first term. He was looking into federal workers, and all the different work that people that are employed by the federal government do. And out of that came his book, The Fifth Risk, which is looking at the danger of losing a lot of our federal workforce. And he became so kind of enamored with these federal workers that he proposed this project. And each of these 8 essays looks at a different federal worker or agency. Some of them look at whole agencies that are people that you would never have heard of and yet have had huge contributions to American life. So these unsung heroes, because when we think of federal workers, right, we think of bureaucrats or politicians, yet there are millions of people that are under the employ of the federal government who do amazing things all the time. So one of the people that are profiled is someone who has done structural work to make sure that coal mines don't collapse on themselves. Another one is in charge of the cemeteries for all of the national cemeteries and the cemeteries for everyone from the armed forces. Another one is looking at people that are working with NASA, trying to change how different satellites are put into orbit so we can see further than we've ever seen before. And like this, they look at people that are working in government, that are technically federal employees, that don't ever get heard about, that are never talked about, and they aren't seeking fame, they aren't seeking glory. In almost all federal jobs, most of the people that work for the federal government could work, if they're working in some sort of specialized field, could work in the private sector and be make much more money in the process. So they're dedicated to our country and to helping others in a way that leads them to these federal jobs. And this is just a really good celebration of that. So it's really heartwarming in that regard. Now, these essays were written before the current administration came, and Doge has been, gutting millions of federal jobs. And so there is a bittersweet part of this as well. Reading this now, realizing that these individuals may not even be employed anymore because our government doesn't care about them. They don't care about the people that make our country work in ways that are important. So there is this bittersweet aspect to reading it now. I will say it's inspiring in two regards. One, it shows you these individuals who really care and shows that as an individual, you can have monumental change on the world and on the country and on people around you. So it reminds you that there are countless unsung heroes that aren't looking for fame and yet are really holding others on their shoulders, and they really do care about others. And that is intrinsically like a good, warm feeling. But it's also inspiring because it reminds you that you can be an unsung hero. You don't have to have the weight of a whole government behind you. An individual can be life-changing for either one person or for many people. So it's inspiring in that way. Never mind if you want to work for a federal government or not, but as an individual, you can affect change in the world in a meaningful way. So it's inspiring in that regard. I will say, again, it's bittersweet because we are, in America at least, gutting the federal government and we don't really care about these people. But it was a really uplifting kind of read, so I appreciated it. And the audiobook, every one of the essays is narrated by the author of that essay, which is also nice. So that completes the audiobooks I read. Now, moving on. There are two books that I already have full-length reviews for, so I'll just mention them in passing. The first one was Overgrowth by Mira Grant. This is a space invasion kind of horror story. I really enjoyed it. It's a little bit slow-moving, so if you want a really frenetic, paced horror story, then you're not going to find it here. It's a little bit slow-moving, but it is great, and what it's really doing is exploring what does it mean to know yourself and to be confident about who you are, especially when you say, I know who I am, and others tell you, no, you're wrong. Then others don't believe you or insist that you aren't who you say you are. So coming to terms with who you are and the truth of who you are and being proud of that and upholding that in the face of opposition of others who refuse to accept you. That is what it's really exploring. And so there's a full-length video for that. And then When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy. This is incredible. It is his take on a werewolf story. And it is a woman who is, a failing or a struggling actress, let's say, and she comes home one night after a hard shift at her diner job, and there's a young boy who has run away, and you see his father chasing after him, and so wherever his father goes, there's death and destruction, and she has to try to save this boy, or she makes the decision to try to save this boy, so they go on the run away from his father. Now, this story is about fathers and about parents. What does it mean to run away from parents? Parents that are maybe abusive, but also parents that are loving and kind. What does it mean to turn your back on parents, to try to flee from them? Parents that are living, parents that are dead. What does it mean to try to create yourself in the shadow of something else? And so this story is about reconciling that. What does it mean to run away from something that you desperately want to have the affirmation of at the same time? This conflicting emotion, this constant internal conflict about logic and emotion. And what does it mean to look at someone and prescribe to them all of your greatest fears and yet desperately want their acceptance at the same time? So this is a really, really wonderful story exploring that. There is a full-length review on my channel. And I'll say those two stories are probably in my top 5 horror novels that I've read of the year. So they are wonderful. I'm really glad I got a chance to read them. I will say that Overgrowth, I read an advanced reader copy. I was given a copy by the publisher. When the Wolf Comes Home, not the case. I did buy that one myself. Another advanced reader copy I read was The Starving Saints by Caitlin Starling. This one, I don't think I'm going to have a standalone review for. This is the third book by Caitlin Starling I read. The first one, The Luminous Depths, I really enjoyed. I read that right around when it came out. And recently, Alex posted his review, and he didn't enjoy it. So I looked back as to what made me enjoy it so much. And really, I thought she did a great job of creating atmosphere. That story takes place mostly in caves underground. And this claustrophobia and this sense of isolation and just the world building and the immersion into the story, I think Caitlin Starling does really well. And that's also true for this novel that the newest novel that I read. However, the second novel I read from her, I think The Last to Leave the Room, it's called. It's like a doppelganger horror / techno thriller. That one I didn't like as much. I liked the overall story, but it took way too long to get there. And, the inciting incident, which is what is part of the marketing material didn't happen until about 3/4 of the way through the book. So I liked the overall story and the idea, but it just the pacing was really, really lopsided, and it didn't really work for me. So I went into this one a little bit trepidatious, and I have to say I leave equally trepidatious. I think so. This one is called This is called The Starving Saints, and it's marketed as a medieval horror story, and some of the marketing calls it a medieval fever dream, and it lives up to those things. I will say part of the problem with it is that it's not really a medieval horror story. It's a second world fantasy. And what that means is it takes place in a world that's similar but not quite the same as our own. And the reason fantasy writers create worlds like that is because they can use it as a shortcut to let you have some familiarity with what's going on, but they don't have to follow any of the rules of our current world, right? So that gives them a freedom there. But you have to fill in those details. And the problem with the story is it doesn't fill in those details. So it takes place all in one castle, right? The king is visiting this castle, and then they are under siege and from an opposing army. And when we start the story, they've been under siege for 6 months, and they are almost, starved out. That they have like 2 weeks worth left of food, because it's not just the king and the attendants of the castle, but all of the peasants that work, or are under the protection of that particular castle. They're all within the castle walls as well, right? So that's where our story starts. And so it has the feel of like a medieval European kingdom, okay? But the problem is it isn't that. And for instance, our 3 main characters are all women, and one of them is a knight. She is the main knight who is the protector of the lord of the castle and is sworn to the king. And so obviously gender roles aren't what we'd expect them to be. Never mind that there is a strong religious order who have a priory or a small, I guess you could say a nunnery in the castle grounds, and that is run by a prioress. They're all nuns. There aren't any men there, and they are not only in charge of religion and belief and faith, but also magic a little bit and science. Most of the peasants can't read or write or do arithmetic. It's only the people that are part of the religious order that can, and this is all this power that is controlled by women, right? And so the gender dynamics are really strange because they still seem to be this patriarchal / misogynistic relationship between men and women, yet women constantly hold these positions of power. And similarly, the god that they worship, the saints of the title, is the constant lady. And whether there's another god above her isn't clear. That what their religion really believes isn't clear, except that they worship and pray to her. And then she has a number of saints in her retinue, both male and female. And so we don't know anything about the world outside of this castle. We don't know anything about this opposing army. We don't know if this king was a good king and he's being unjustly persecuted by a neighboring country that, is evil or, seeking out power. Or maybe he is not a great king. The fact that no one is coming to his rescue, no one in his family, none of his sons are coming to mount a rescue could suggest that. So there's so much we don't know about this world, and she leaves it open and ambiguous. And in general, I'm happy with there being ambiguity in stories, but you need to give me something to latch onto. And the problem with this story is it's just one ambiguous thing on top of another. And that's because what Caitlin Starling does really well is atmosphere and mood and vibes, but that isn't the same stuff as world building, right? It's how you feel about a thing, but not how the pieces of a thing fit together. And so that's the case here. The vibes and the emotion and the atmosphere is really strong, but the world building doesn't support it. And the same goes for the characters. We have 3 main characters we follow, 3 women. The one who is a mad woman or a witch. She's a heretic. She was part of this religious group, but then she was kicked out. Yet the lord of this castle believes her to be his mad woman, and she can perform miracles. Now, we don't really know why, and that's never really solved, but she is trying to solve the problem of creating food from nothing, create a miracle for him. She already created a miracle where she figured out how to purify their water. Otherwise, they would have all died, months ago. So she is performing these miracles, but we don't know why. Then, as I said, the other one is this knight who is the protector of the king and the lord of the castle. And then the third point of view we have is a woman who is one of the peasants who I think is a seamstress or she's a glove maker. Yet you find out she has other connections to some of the other characters, which you find out as the story progresses. It's interesting to move back and forth between these 3 points of view because what happens is, as they're starving, as everyone in the castle is about to die, the saints show up out of nowhere. So the constant lady and her retinue of saints appear, and with them, they bring these glorious feasts, and everyone falls under their spell, and they enjoy this bacchanalia. But when you look a little closer, you see what are they really feasting on, and what is really happening in this castle, and it's really disturbing. And only these 3 women, for some reason, aren't under the spell, so they have to figure out what's going on. Are these really the saints come to save them, or is it something more sinister? How do they break that spell, and how do they deal with the fact that even if they break that spell, they're under siege by an army and they can't escape the castle walls? The setup is interesting. The atmosphere, the vibes are really heavy. Some of the imagery is really vibrant and visceral. Like some of it is really, as I said, this is a means of last resort to survive here. And so when people are starving, what is going to be on the dinner table? As you can imagine, some of the imagery is very graphic. Yet there doesn't seem to be any sort of interior journey happening with these women, but just things happen around them. Do you know what I mean? And so again, it just has to do, my disappointment is that there's so many good ideas and they have interesting characters that just don't have things to do. Instead, things happen to them. And there's interesting atmosphere and vibe, but it's not based in a world that we understand anything about. So I just needed something to latch onto. I felt like I was constantly grasping air and not getting anything, except just having all of these vibes. So if vibe-based horror and really atmospheric horror that is filled with some really incredible kind of visceral imagery, then there's a lot of fun here. And there are some ideas that are being played with about autonomy, about relationships, about how you treat others. These are all interesting ideas that are explored in some ways. For me, I wanted there to be a little bit more heft to it, a little bit more that I could actually like sink my teeth into. It'll depends on what kind of flavor you like your horror to come in. But for me, it didn't quite live up to my expectations, and it is again making me a little bit, not sure how quickly I'll jump into more Caitlin Starling in the future. So then moving on, there are only 2 more books that I have to talk about. The first one is Children of Ruin by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is the second book in the Children of Time series, and I really, really enjoyed this. Many people have said that the second book isn't that good, or it isn't as good as the first or the third. It's the weakest of the trilogy. And I can understand people say that. I think the first one, you go into it and you see this world building and this like epic scope that he is embracing in this world that he's created, and it wows you, right? It's very much overwhelming in that regard. So you have these expectations already of what's going to happen going into the second novel, and you can't have that first experience a second time. So that takes away a little bit. And I also say that the first story, it has 2 competing narratives. One is of these hyper-evolved spiders, and one of these humans who are probably the last humans that exist on a generational arc ship. And these 2 stories run parallel to each other, and they go over thousands of years, right? Because the humans keep going into, suspended animation, and the spiders move on from one generation to the next. So you don't have one singular spider that you're following. You have these archetypical characters that are part of the spider society. But those 2 stories move in parallel to each other. And so you get a chance to really have this narrative depth to the characters themselves, and that you really can relate to the characters. In the second novel, there are multiple stories happening at the same time, but they're happening at different points in time. One's happening in the past, and one's happening in the present. And you know that they're going to meet, but they are separated. And as a result of that, they both have numerous characters that you're following, and there are lots of separate character story arcs that seem to be moving in different directions. So it doesn't have the narrative thrust to the character development that the first novel had. It still has incredibly complicated, really lovable / dastardly characters that you really like spending time with as a reader, but you don't have the storytelling itself doesn't lead you in one direction. It leads you in multiple directions. So it's easy not to, or rather I should say, it's more difficult to feel like you have the same level of emotional investment in the characters as you do in the first novel. But with that said, I think the characters are great. I think the story is great. I think the pacing is a little bit drawn out, but I don't really mind that in his stories because they're so rich that like it's such a complicated tapestry that I don't mind that it's a little bit drawn out because there's always something new and shiny and interesting for me to look at. The ideas and the world building and just the overall experience of the novel is so much fun that I don't mind it being stretched out a little bit. So I really enjoyed this. I'm probably going to do a review of the whole trilogy when I finish it. So I still have 1 book left, and The Children of Memory. And so when I finish it, I'll talk more about it then. Though I should say, it's now announced that it's not a trilogy. The Children of Strife is the 4th book, and that's coming out next year, I think March of 2026. But I'll still probably do a review of the first 3 books, the original trilogy. And so that will be coming up in the next few months, depending on when I finish the next book. And then the last book that I finished this month, which I just finished last night, is Wake Up and Open Your Eyes. And this is by Clay McLeod Chapman. And this is not subtle in any way, shape, or form. This started as a short story, which I actually read the short story, and that was in a collection called Found, which was, the found footage equivalent of horror stories. And that was edited by Gabino Iglesias and Andrew Cull, I think. And I read that short story. I really enjoyed it. And when I heard this book, I was like, wait a second, don't I know this? And that's when I realized that he took that short story and he expanded it. And the premise is a man in his early 40s with a family lives in Brooklyn, and he's from Virginia. His parents are conservative. The rest of his family is conservative. And he's been trying to get in touch with his mother, and she's not answering. That's very much unlike her. And so he feels like something is wrong. He goes down to see what's going on, and they are just staring in front of their TV screens, totally transfixed in a zombified daze, right? Watching Fox News, as it may be. And then they switch and become incredibly violent and attack him. And all of a sudden, all of the U.S. is in chaos, and about half the population have become these ultra-violent, ultra-sexual, just mindless automatons that are causing chaos. And that is the setup for the story. That happens all in the first maybe 10% of the story. And then he has to get back to New York to be with his family, right? So Clay McCall Chapman isn't pulling any punches. Like, this isn't subtle. This is him taking a hammer and just beating you over the head with it. Now, what he does, though, is the main part of the story, actually. So the whole second part, which is the longest part, maybe 50% of the book, takes a break from our main character. And it goes back a month. And instead of following our main character, it follows his brother. And so he has an elder brother who has a wife and 2 kids. And it follows them, and it shows how they become radicalized, for lack of a better word. How, whether they, become mesmerized by wellness gurus on Instagram, or they start watching Fox News because it doesn't feel like it's talking down to them, or whether they, get lost in kind of an incel rabbit hole on the internet, whatever it may be, you see how they go from being quote unquote normal to becoming radicalized to the point of ultraviolence over the course of a month. So the main part of the story cuts away from our main character to show what happens, how you can fall down this rabbit hole, and how it doesn't take a lot. It just takes a little bit of a push to send people over the edge. So that I thought was interesting. It was a weird way to structure the story, because then you get back to our main character, and we switched from the close third-person narration of the first 2 sections to a second-person narration. And it's not only a second-person narration, it is a second-person narration as narrated by Anderson Cooper, because our main character is convinced that, in his mind, a mental Anderson Cooper is now telling him the events of his life as he's living it. But so the result of that is you are being spoken to as a reader, right? The constant you are being addressed in this narration. And so you feel complicit. The author is not for a moment letting the reader be separate from the art. He's saying, I'm looking at you, and you are responsible for this. You have to deal with this. And that is interesting and exciting. It's wild. It's kind of a fever dream. I will say he's not entirely one-sided, where he kind of takes shots at everyone, and he takes shots at those people who haven't been won over by Fox News, but yet don't have any means to protect themselves or to have any meaningful contribution to the discourse, right? So it's not just a one-sided kind of argument. He's kind of looking at all of American society and saying there is a giant failure here across the board, and we all need to do better, because if you don't do better, this is what's going to happen. But there's no subtlety to it, and so you have to know that going in. It does border on splatterpunk. Like, there are some scenes that are really, really graphic and horrific. There is sexual assault, there is violence against children, violence against animals. Though I think most of the violence against animals happens off page, but it is alluded to. It is over the top and graphic. And, if you have a queasy stomach, this isn't the right book for you. It doesn't ever feel, the violence at least, doesn't feel cynical. The violence doesn't feel voyeuristic, but it does feel inevitable in some ways, which makes it almost more terrifying. Now, the book, however, is somewhat cynical and nihilistic. And that is what leaves me, unsure of where I want to go with it. As a story, being cynical and nihilistic, I think, is fine. It's an interesting tenor to the story. It's a color to paint with, and I enjoyed it. But if you look at the story as an appraisal of American society, then that cynicism and that nihilism is really depressing, right? So as a story, if it wasn't such a strong allegory to the world we live in, then it's an interesting story. But when you consider that this is a heavy-handed allegory for contemporary American society, then it ceases being as fantastical and fun, and it becomes a little bit more of like a gut punch. And so then what you do with that, I guess, is up to you as a reader, because again, in his second person narration through the whole last third of the book, it is very clear that this is being directly addressed to the reader as individuals who have something to say and something to do as members of contemporary society, whether American society or the global society. So it's definitely an interesting book, not for the faint of heart, not for people that are looking for subtle ideas, but if you're interested in a little bit of cathartic nihilism, then, this is definitely the book to go do for that. And so that has been the first half of my month. Those are the titles that I finished. What am I reading now? I'm reading 2 books right now. I am reading the book that held her heart. This is the final book in the Library trilogy by Mark Lawrence, and I really loved the first 2 books in the trilogy. This one I'm about 2/3 of the way through, and I'm not loving it as much, but I'll have more to say when I finish it. I want to finish it before I have any final thoughts on it. Overall, I love the ideas that it's presenting. We'll see. I'm not going to pass any judgment until I finish it. I still have a ways to go yet. And then I'm also reading a collection of short stories by Ramsey Campbell called Scared Stiff. And, I bought this quite a while ago at the bookstore, at the used bookstore that I visit whenever I go into Bangalore, and it's been on my shelf. But just recently, Cliff from Cliff's Dark Gems, just this week, he reviewed it because he just read it last month, and so that inspired me to take it off the shelf and to read it. I've only read 1 story so far, but it only has 7 stories in it, and so far I'm enjoying it. I'll probably finish it quite quickly. Like I said, it's only 7 stories and it's small, so in the next few days I'm sure I'll be done with this and moving on to other books on my TBR. TBR hasn't changed from my last video. I do have one more nonfiction book I want to read that is a memoir by Brian Keene called The End of the Road. And then I have a couple of vintage horror novels, and I don't know which one I'm going to get to. I don't think I'm going to get all of them. One is The Traveling Vampire Show by Richard Lehman. And then The White Plague by Frank Herbert. And then GARBOLOGY by Clive Barker. So I had originally hoped to get through all 3 of these this month. That's not going to happen at all. There's no chance of that. I'm probably going to start with the Frank Herbert one, The White Plague, and that is the biggest, but that's the one I've had on my shelf for the longest. So I'm going to start with that and then see where we go from there. I do have another short story collection I want to read by Joe Lansdale. This is In the Mad Mountains, and it's Joe Lansdale's writing inspired by Lovecraft. And I have another advanced reader copy of another collection of short stories by Joe Lansdale called like The Best of Joe Lansdale, and that doesn't come out for a few months, so I want to read this first and get that done with, just so I have a little more of his short story history before going into the best of, as it may be. And then the other big book on my TBR list is The Ship of Destiny. This is the last book in the Live Ship Trader series by Robin Hobb, and so this is definitely going to be my next book that I pick up once I finish the Library trilogy. And then as far as the horror books, we'll see, and who knows what I'm going to get from the library in terms of audiobooks, and those will keep me throughout the month. So that is what I have going on this month. As you can see, this video is really long, so imagine if it was double the length, which is what it was shaping up to the first time I recorded it. So I'm going to stop here. I mentioned a lot of books. I'd love to hear if you've read any of those books, if you have any thoughts about any of them, or if you want me to talk more at length about them, leave me some questions or comments down below, and I'll be happy to engage with you in that. But for now, I'll say thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.